Judge, jury, and executioner? I know we had this conversation 2 weeks ago, but it is inevitable to talk about this topic if I really like video games. So, as a responsible human, I gotta say that this video is to inform, not a kind of tutorial or anything like that, and I am not inviting people to do illicit actions or modify their equipment. Dear viewer, remember that there are always chances to get a virus, malware, or other kinds of things, and I am no lawyer. But there will be several hypothetical cases to properly explain this topic. And yes, I am saying this in my own free will, and not because he's here. With that out of the way, let's talk about piracy. Specifically, some of the most important topics like emulators, ROMs, DRMs, of course in a brief way, otherwise I can stay here for several hours, culture and opinions. I'll try to explain all of these topics in a friendly way. So, without further ado, let's begin. Are emulators legal? And to answer this question, we need to go back in time to 1998, where a company named Connectix was developing the Virtual Game Station, a software to emulate PlayStation video games. After different tests, they were able to release the product in December from the same year. Needless to say that this didn't sit well for Sony. In January 1999, they had a complaint against Connectix because of copyright and IP violations. And thanks to Sony, in this case, we are able to use emulators in a legal way. Because what they didn't know is that the Virtual Game Station was reverse engineered, or in other words, made without copying the original BIOS from Sony. So the court saw this as fair use. Yep, Sony shot its foot. Because of this and another case with Blim. These cases created a precedent where it is possible to create emulators. In other words, if people reverse engineer the BIOS, it is legal. The funny part comes when leaks appear left and right, or when people brute force their way the first day a console is released. In these cases is where, okay, they have the original BIOS, and they can be like, I didn't see anything. Because this is where we start another game, between my worth versus their worth. How do they know I was able to see the original BIOS? Do you have a way to prove this? And yeah, there's not too much after that because of the aforementioned precedent. But what is the case of the ROMs? This is where it depends. A ROM is pretty much the copy of a game. I recommend to check the laws from your country, because in some, it is perfectly legal to do ROMs. Needless to say that you need to have the original game. Nonetheless, in some countries this sits in a grayish area, or it is completely illegal. Of course, what's illegal is to upload that copy of the game and distribute it, or download ROMs from internet. Nonetheless, the ironic part comes once again with, how do they know I am using a ROM? This would come down to another case of my worth versus their worth. In these cases, companies start to look for people when they encourage downloading ROMs. Now, in general there is not too much involvement from different companies when fans bring a hack. There are thousands of them. However, things go downhill when the release date of a game using that IP is near, which was the case for another Metroid 2 remake and several Pokemon games, like Uranium and stuff like that. However, in these cases, there is always the friendly cease and desist, because of course they don't want to ruin their reputation by suing fans. But in some of those cases, the original devs leave the code for anyone to work with it, and that is how some other devs appear and say, well, we don't have that cease and desist letter, so we will continue. Here it is fair to mention that each game has an end user license agreement, aka EULA. This is the wet dream from every company, so here you will find several things that could be questionable as heck. But just remember, none of this BS is above the law, so even if they put something like you cannot transfer, sell the game or something like that, they are not above the law, so you can still do it. But this is also the reason why they can shut down people who mod some games. Specifically, Nintendo is against these kinds of practices, so unless you want to get targeted, don't do it. As for Capcom, most likely it is because there's a lot of people who needs to touch grass, and to me it is quite hilarious to see these kinds of mods, But what can I say? Probably Capcom doesn't see this with the same eyes. This is also where you can find the statements like, you don't own the game, and this is but a personal license, and if something happens, you are going to defend the company in turn. In easy terms, most EULAs are filled with plenty of absurd things, because your app to listen to music obviously has what is needed to make nuclear stuff. DRMs stand for Digital Rights Management, or in other words, a way to prevent piracy. Through the years there's been different ways to prevent piracy. If you lived when the save icon was a thing, you may remember that some of them were impossible to copy, which was actually messed up, because these things stopped functioning if they got hit because of magnetism, electric discharges, or if you offended its feelings. But there were many other creative ways or restrictive ones, as the code wheel, chunky little books, reddish pieces of paper, and so on. Time later, other kinds of methods would be thrown as having something like a key in the piece of hardware or CDs. As for PCs, the most known DRMs are Secure ROM, where once again Sony appears. Well, the deal here is that you were not able to install the game more than 3 times. So of course the community was against this kinds of practice, even when it was increased to 5. Time later, Star Force will appear too, where plenty of people pointed it as a kind of malware, sometimes damaging PCs and limiting certain actions, or having to use other means to uninstall stuff because of the system. Of course, there was a lot of beef between Star Force and the community. In between, it is worth saying that each console had different kinds of ways to protect their games, such as having to be online all the time, getting into complex math, etc. Fast forward nowadays, Secure ROM changed to the Nubo, the newest kind of DRM, which obfuscates the code. For example, let's say that the original code uses a word like jump. Okay, now we can make it look like that. So yep, it means jump. Now imagine that the whole code is filled with these kinds of lines, where some may work and some not. Needless to say that this is madness for plenty of people, but the real thing with the Nubo is that, in theory, it should reduce but 1% efficiency while running the game, commonly using loading screens and stuff like that. But then we have cases like Tekken 7, where you may wonder what happened here. Needless to say, that there is some untold beef within these companies, saying things like, wasn't that function barely used? It is not our problem if your dev team is dumb as heck picking said function when it shouldn't. Now, I don't know if I want to trust comparisons, because oftentimes there are many patches in between, or there are times when some cracked games run in a worse way than the one with the Nubo, so no idea, to be honest. Here it is important to say, sure, people found Hypervisor, but if you don't know what you're doing, I recommend to stay away from those systems, primarily because you can compromise your whole PC, to the point where maybe you will have to erase absolutely everything, even boot options. But yeah, that depends from case to case. If you have done it, some of the ways in which you can check if you messed up is by looking at the driver's route. And if something appears when you start playing with these options, let me tell you, yamamaste! If the secure boot doesn't start, chances are that you won't be able to do many things, so just erase everything, boot included. And unless you're extremely unlucky, there are cases where the BIOS can get messed up, but those are really specific cases. With all of this, what can I say? That is the long story short, because every time human beings see something like a black box, they try to open it, using brute force, risking hardware, using markers, overloading the memory, drilling the motherboard, by inserting clips, with games of the store, or even trying to build big arse things. On that front, I don't think piracy will be controlled, especially when the person who pays for the original game has a worse experience than the person who takes the Buccaneer route. We all have heard plenty of times what Gabe Newell said. Piracy is a service problem. And I definitely agree. This is a topic that cannot be seen as black or white, unless by own choice, you decided to close your eyes to the outside world, trying to live in a bubble. It fits like a glove when few days ago the thing about near reincarnation exploded. I don't know how USA is living this event, but at least here in Mexico, it turned into a battle between South Korea, Japan versus pretty much whole LATAM, Chinese and Russians. But I don't want to be polemic. I believe piracy has way too many nuances that we could talk about this topic hours upon hours. Now, I mentioned the bubble thing because it is easy to shut your eyes and believe that just because you have it, everyone else has it too. Even the so-called Japanese who enforce the law at one time had to pirate Fyodor Dostoevsky. But going further down that topic is getting into politics, ideologies, and the way in which a society is indoctrinated. But this is no History Channel, so even if they see us as primitive monkeys, what can I say? It is a bigger problem than just calling names. Being thrown into the primitive monkey realm is the least of issues. But if I may be seen as an animal, please let me be a turtle. Now, I took my time to ask people left and right. Some of you already know that I work with people from all around the globe, so I was there asking things like, "A ver, putísimo japonés de mierda, si es como me ves?" I concluded that piracy is like a necessary evil, because it is true that I got to know many video games because of weird cases like Pokemon Diamond, aka Kentai Denju Telefang. This is a game that I most likely would never have played, because it wasn't even distributed here, and like that, it wouldn't be hard to make a list of thousands of non-distributed games, at least here in Mexico. And it is not hard to visualize, because if you saw my video about Armored Core, you hear me say, Bandai Namco Store doesn't send things here. If that is the case, what do you think is going to happen with a country that is a bit further away? Exactly that. Plus, for some dumb reason, they thought that Japanese is spoken everywhere. It would be as dumb as if I say that Spanish is spoken everywhere. Same principle goes for any other language. Of course, the deal with accessibility is that the more you go to the south, the more problems start to appear. If we complain about the Switch 2 price, in Brazil, this thing is sold like gold. Going back in time here in Mexico, it was really hard to get certain consoles. Nintendo was one of the few that reached this place, reason why some magazines were literally named Club Nintendo. Getting a PC back then was a nightmare, and most parents were against video games. So those were dire moments. Okay, that was like 40 years ago. Have things changed for the better? Yes and no. Sure, we can find them in stores, but nowadays video games are expensive as heck. The $60 mark was okay. We lived like that for a lot of time, and even if we lost several things in between, we still accept it. But now you go for 80. With that money you can eat like a pig here. With this example I wanted to make a point, because it was pretty much proved that when we receive things with reasonable prices and good quality, people will pay for it, which was the case for Silksong. Yes, it was cheaper here, and the culture was, you don't pirate Silksong. Generally speaking, when the community is treated poorly is when cases like Nintendo start to appear, where most say, you don't buy Nintendo, you emulate it. I can assure you that history would be different if they hadn't earned hatred the way they did. So all of those things have to be considered. In my case, as many of you, I wasn't able to get that many video games. Today, I am grateful for having the job I have, because acquiring things isn't that big of a deal, unless tariffs and taxes go overboard. Of course, there is no shame to pirate things when they were forgotten or abandoned by these companies. And I would have liked to have the whole world of possibilities people have today, because you can do extraordinary things with consoles like the PSP, Wii, 3DS, etc. And yes, giving those consoles a second life is better than just let them get dusty. For companies, that is like a nightmare, because they want you to consume more and more. They care about your money. Happy investors is much more important than taking care of their customers. At least, if you are paying for their games, it would be good to be treated like a partner, but that is not the case. What do you think is going to be people's natural reaction? Do I need to remind you what happened when you had to watch a dumb commercial? And on top of that, with copyrighted material? So once again, I believe in what Gabe Newell said. I am not fond of digital content, but at least Steam offers a platform with good accessibility and plenty of games. If you have followed the channel for a while, you know I'm more into physical content, So yeah, as soon as I have the chance to get the stuff for a decent price, I don't mind paying for them. On the other hand, if you just don't want to send the stuff here, and I happen to find them by other means, then that was a sale you were not even expecting. So, what's the matter? Fortunately, movements like Stop Killing Games are going in the right direction, and hopefully, we can leave these kinds of discussions in the past. But being honest, that is a bit too positive. In any case, I am glad that people out there are trying to preserve the games, because it is more than obvious that most companies don't really care about that.